We are back here on the show now, and like I mentioned before the break, we are discussing more on the Chiefs and the Buffalo Bills because we just couldn't leave it to the game and reviewing the game and everything that happened. But the aftermath, I think, does hold some value just because, this game was the game everybody wanted to see, right? It was the game of history, legacies being defined, history continuing with the Chiefs still looking to three-peat, whether or not the Bills were going to stop them and get back to a Super Bowl and things like that, and kind of try and forget about the four straight Super Bowls that they lost in the 90s and things like that. For Josh Allen, could he join that very, very short list of quarterbacks that have beaten Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs? It still only remains at Tom Brady and Joe Burrow. But because none of that actually happened and the Chiefs are going back to the Super Bowl, I wanted to focus on the Bills here a little bit because, Josh Allen is now 0-4 against Patrick Mahomes in the playoffs. And just saying that, him being the only quarterback to be 0-4 against another quarterback in playoff history is just brutal. And especially on Josh because I think for a lot of people, whether it's Lamar or Josh, it's always Lamar or Josh, right? It's always one of those two guys vying for that spot to be the closest one to dethrone Patrick, right? They always feel like they're the most common rival, the most common opponent in the playoffs, right? And I know Joe has actually beaten him, but he's really not been in the picture as much because his team just isn't as good as the Bills or the Ravens. So it always feels like it's Josh or Lamar, and Josh has had a couple of good cracks at it, and he's come the closest without actually beating him. And you know that he's a great quarterback. You know he has all the tools, and the maturity that we've seen from him has been tremendous to see at where he's at now to where he was in his first and second year. You probably would have never thought it was the same quarterback, but truly, it still hasn't been enough to get over that mountain. And since 2018, the Bills have 77 regular season wins, which is the third most, only to the Kansas City Chiefs and the Baltimore Ravens. And in that time, they're 7-6 in the playoffs, with four of those losses obviously coming to the Chiefs. And when you combine both of those, the 84 wins that the Buffalo Bills have in that time since 2018 are the most by any team that hasn't made it to a Super Bowl yet in NFL history. And it's insane when you kind of put it like that. And there's a bunch of other stats to kind of put this into perspective. But after a failed tush push, after a drop pass on fourth down, is it now a scenario where we could start talking about whether the Bills, not that their playoff window is closed or that their championship window is closed, but I can't help but put myself in a situation where I'm thinking like they've had four cracks at it now to beat Patrick, and they've lost another AFC Championship game. How realistic is it to kind of start talking about, are they closer to not making it back to this point, or are they closer to still being in contention for the Super Bowl, right? Because when you look at the AFC, to say that the Bills are just going to continue to have their shot and shot and shot at the Kansas City Chiefs, I think is very unrealistic, because obviously you have the Ravens, who probably felt that they should have beat the Bills in the first place, or you have the Bengals, who I expect to be a lot better because of their quarterback. The Chargers aren't going anywhere. The Texans aren't going anywhere because they are winning that division. The Steelers, for as frustrating as they are always going to be in the mix. So while they might be looked upon as a class below, it's still very competitive to get in. And I mean, the Jets, the Dolphins, and the Patriots aren't going to challenge the Bills anytime soon, it doesn't look like. But to say that in the playoffs, it's just always going to be the Bills against the Chiefs each and every year. Dan Campbell said it best, and everyone's used this line since the Bills have lost. But he said it after they got to the NFC Championship game last year against the 49ers, and how they were in a great spot to win that game, but they ended up giving it up. how that could have been their only time that himself or this group ever makes it back, because you truly never know. So I start to have more doubt creep into my head about the Bills, right? I know they're great, they're talented. Sean McDermott definitely should not be looked upon as being fired or anything like that. They don't have to strip this whole thing down, right? Because they lost again. But there is that little bit of doubt, like how confident are we that they're just going to keep getting back here, right? Or was that their best chance? And can they even improve, or can they even move on from it, right? And I feel like a lot of people aren't giving it enough like severity when it comes to losing another game like this, because Josh is, again, the only quarterback that this has ever happened to. The Bills lost 4 straight Super Bowls in the 90s, and now that they've had their best team since then, like the odds on this happening to the Bills now, after I can't even imagine, being a fan of the Bills during that time where my team loses 4 straight Super Bowls, to now have your best team since that time to potentially get back to the Super Bowl, but you run into this like once in a generation, once in like a century player in Patrick Mahomes, who could very well be the best player ever, and now he's always standing in the way of you, seems like a little bit like just unfair and almost too much on the Buffalo Bills. But to not over, exaggerate here, and to kind of reel it back into the Bills and already looking ahead to next year, I would say that, some places where we could see them improve, or where we could see them, at least take a little tiny step forward, and, where they could look to try and right this situation, you could say in areas like wide receiver or defensive back. And I think those two spots were pretty evident and pretty clear that it just needs a little bit of tweaking, or it just needs a little bit more attention going into this year. Because on one hand, I don't like saying that they need like a number one reliable, bona fide $30+ million wide receiver, because they just had one in Stephon Diggs. And I wasn't a big fan of that, and I thought that the Bills were going to go like down and plummet after they let him go, and they did a very good job of changing their identity and changing what this team was about on offense. So I don't like saying now that they need like a Stephon Diggs back, because they already had him, and it still wasn't enough to beat the Chiefs, right? So I don't like saying that, but I still think that in that sort of realm, I just need more from some of these guys, right? And I'm not going to say I'm not, but Dalton Kincaid, for him to drop that pass, I felt he should have caught it. But not only just that pass, but I feel like when you have a guy like him, they took him in the first round. I feel like you need some more production from him. Dawson Knox really wasn't involved too much. And then you look at the wide receivers, Khalil Shakir continues to be their most reliable guy. And you thought you were actually getting one of those number one guys in Amari Cooper, but his performance and his form was very sporadic. And again, the Bills love to run the ball, and they're a very run-heavy team. So that's just who they are, and there's no problem with that. But I feel like whether it be their offense or Josh not really getting the ball to them as much, but I just feel like wide receiver needs some more production out of that group. And whether it was a fact that it was just too early for guys like Keon Coleman and, to some respect, Dalton Kincaid, because he's only in his second year, that could be fair. But in these games, you need some of those wow moments, and some of those players and guys that can go out there, and no matter what, the coverage, the scenario, the quarter, anything like that they can go out and give you one of those magical plays. And Khalil Shakir is good, he's very good, but I'm not so sure that they trust him quite like that. So, that is one area where I thought they could get more production from and see some sort of improvement. But the bigger one was defensive back. And I think this one was very obvious when Christian Benford went down, and he went down with a head injury, which was scary. But then you saw Kaiir Elam come in for Christian Benford, and Kaiir Elam was a former first-round pick as well for the Bills. And as soon as he came in, it was pretty clear that he was playing very safe, like very conservative, right? Every time it was either man coverage or zone, he was very like 7 to 5 yards away from the wide receiver, and he was just playing very conservative, trying to keep everything in front of him. But when you're that far, right, when you're not really affecting the wide receiver that much, you're giving a guy like Patrick, the worst guy you want to give it to, some sort of cushion and advantage there, right? And they kept going after him, play after play after play. You always saw number 5 for the Buffalo Bills in coverage there for some point in the kind of like the middle portion of the game. So really throughout the entire season, I do understand the point where like this team, we've mentioned it before, it's a very zone favorable team. They'd rather run zone and keep everything in front of them and control the pace of the game. So all these opportunities that you might get on defense, you got to be methodical, you got to be pinpoint accurate and everything like that to beat this zone, because they're not going to beat themselves. They're going to stand back there and keep everything in front of them and force you to make a mistake, right? But when you're playing against Patrick, like, he'll just pick apart that zone. He'll go up and down the field on it, and he's methodical anyway this year, right? That is a clear characteristic of the Chiefs this year anyway. So the zone was never going to work. Being conservative and things like that was not going to work against Patrick. So they were forced to play man coverage, and it was something that you could clearly see they weren't very comfortable with, and it wasn't very much them for whether it be the scheme or they're just not comfortable with it. It just felt like they were out of their element in that regard, in that, portion of the game. So I think improving at defensive back and, just as a simple comparison, getting a guy like Tre'Davious White and what he was able to do for you, I think that would go a long way in just bringing more guys to other areas of the field, if anything, right? If you know you have a great corner on one side, you can kind of leave him off to his own, and you can still trust him to get the job done, like the Chiefs do very much with Trent McDuffie. It allows them to do a lot more with their defense because they have so much trust in Trent McDuffie. That's why they let L'Jarius Sneed go, right? That was a big talking point in the offseason, but they felt they had another number one guy there, and look at them now, right? They're back in the Super Bowl. So I think doing things like that and improving, these minor details, right? I'm not saying that all their defensive backs are trash or all their wide receivers are really bad. They just got to get a little bit better, just kind of fine tune it and really try and whittle out any sort of doubt that you might have with these positions. Because I think everywhere else they're pretty strong, quite honestly. So when it comes to the Chiefs and these big games, it's all those fine margins, and you're only as strong as your weakest point. And I think their weakest points ended up letting them down on Sunday, whereas the Chiefs, weakest points, right, they all ended up making plays. So that's where I kind of see it going for the Buffalo Bills. Still very, very early before we really consider anything in terms of making changes, but yeah, not a lot to say about the Bills, right? Still very brutal, very tough loss for them. But we will get to our final segment now of the show, and we're going to go to the other side of things, the happier side of things in Kansas City, and just basically identify 3 things that have really made this team this year, this specific team this year, so successful. What do they do better than all the other teams in the AFC to represent the conference once again? We're going to get to that when we return after this.